There are places on Earth where the ground remembers, where the soil has absorbed more than rain, where the trees have stood still for so long, they seem to listen. Places where silence does not feel empty, but heavy, watchful, almost complicit. On a wooded hill near the German city of Weimar, a place once celebrated for poets, philosophers, and ideas about the dignity of man, stood one of the most disturbing institutions ever created by human hands. It was not hidden in some distant wasteland. It did not exist at the edge of civilization. It stood beside it. Its name was Buchenwald. Trains passed nearby. Smoke rose steadily above the trees. Life continued beyond the wire. And inside those fences, something far worse than death unfolded. Because what happened at Buchenwald was not only suffering measured in starvation, disease, exhaustion, or even death. It was something colder, more deliberate. Here, human beings were stripped not just of their lives, but of their meaning. Their bodies were studied, catalogued, and in some cases, transformed. This is not just a story of how people died. It is a story of what was done after they were already gone. Buchenwald Concentration Camp was established in July 1937. By direct order of the SS. Officially, it was described in neutral language, a protective custody camp. A place meant to hold those considered enemies of the state. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, writers, teachers. Anyone who had spoken too loudly, thought too freely, or refused to conform. At first, many Germans believed this explanation. After all, the prisoners were labeled as dangerous, undesirable, a threat to order. But Buchenwald was never about protection. It was about control. From the beginning, the camp was designed not simply to confine, but to break. The camp rose quickly on the forested Ettersberg Hill, overlooking the city of Weimar. Prisoners themselves were forced to build it, cutting trees, hauling stone, erecting barracks that they would soon be imprisoned inside. Men collapsed during construction. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who could not stand were removed. Some were shot. Others simply disappeared. By 1938, the purpose of Buchenwald expanded. The definition of enemy widened. Jews arrived in increasing numbers, especially after Kristallnacht. Roma and Sinti followed. Jehovah's Witnesses, arrested for refusing military service. Homosexuals, marked with pink triangles. And those the regime labeled asocials, the homeless, the disabled, the unwanted. Each group entered under a different pretext, but all were treated the same. Uniforms were stripped away. Personal belongings confiscated. Hair shaved. Names were replaced with numbers. Identity dissolved into administration. The SS understood something critical. If you remove a person's past, you can more easily erase their future. By 1941, Buchenwald crossed another threshold. That year, Soviet prisoners of war began arriving. They were not registered like other inmates. They were not meant to survive. Thousands were taken directly to execution sites within the camp, shot in specially designed killing rooms, their deaths recorded with bureaucratic precision. No trial, no sentence, no witnesses, just numbers, just efficiency. Above the camp gate, forged into iron, hung a phrase meant to define justice, Jedem das Sein. To each what he deserves. The words were carefully positioned. They faced inwards. Only prisoners could read them. The message was clear. Your suffering is justified. Your fate is earned. Your humanity is conditional. For the SS, Buchenwald was not chaos. It was a system. Roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing weather. Punishments designed to humiliate rather than kill, at first. Labor meant to exhaust, not immediately destroy. The goal was endurance. How long could a man survive on nothing? How much pain could be inflicted without breaking productivity? At what point did resistance turn into obedience? These were not accidents. They were experiments. And standing at the center of it all was the camp commandant, Karl Otto Koch. Under his leadership, Buchenwald became something more than a prison. It became a proving ground. A place where cruelty could be refined, where suffering could be observed, where death itself could be organized. And this was only the beginning, because soon, the camp would move beyond controlling life. It would begin to claim ownership over death itself. In Buchenwald, the day began before the sun was allowed to rise. Long before light reached the barracks, a whistle cut through the darkness. Not loud, sharp, precise, impossible to ignore. Doors flew open. Men stumbled into the cold, half awake, disoriented, already exhausted before the day had even begun. There were no mirrors in Buchenwald, but if there had been, they would have shown hollow faces, sunken eyes, bodies already shrinking inside threadbare uniforms. Then came roll call. Roll call was not a formality. It was a weapon. Prisoners stood in rigid formation while SS guards counted them. And counted again. And again. Numbers had to match exactly. Any discrepancy, one man missing, one body unaccounted for, and the count began again from the start. It did not matter if it was snowing, raining, or if the sun burned the ground beneath their feet. Men fainted where they stood. Others collapsed slowly, as if their bodies were folding inward. When that happened, the count stopped. Everyone waited. Sometimes guards dragged the collapsed man away. Sometimes they beat him until he stood. Sometimes they waited until he no longer moved at all. Only then did the count continue. This was not discipline. It was a demonstration. A daily reminder that time, comfort, and even life itself belonged to the camp. Food followed roll call, if it could be called food. A thin slice of bread, a bowl of watery soup, often floating with turnip peels or potato skins. Every calorie was calculated, not to sustain life, but to delay death. Hunger in Buchenwald was not sudden. It was constant, a gnawing presence that never left. It hollowed the stomach, clouded the mind, and reshaped morality itself. Men dreamed of food. They argued over crumbs. They stole when they could. Not because they were weak, but because hunger eventually becomes louder than conscience. The SS understood this perfectly. A starving man is easier to control. After food came work. And work in Buchenwald was not assigned to produce results. It was designed to consume bodies. Prisoners hauled massive stones up hills only to carry them back down again. They dug trenches that served no purpose. They cleared land endlessly. They worked in armaments factories until fingers bled and joints failed. Every task was engineered to exhaust. If a man slowed, he was beaten. If he collapsed, he was removed. If he could no longer work, he became something else, a problem. Disease spread easily. Barracks were overcrowded. Lice were everywhere. Typhus and tuberculosis moved through the camp silently, efficiently. Medical care existed, but not to heal. The infirmary was a place of selection. To enter was not always to be treated. Often, it was to be evaluated. Who could still work? Who might recover? Who was no longer useful? Those deemed beyond recovery were marked, not with words, but with decisions. And soon, with silence. But Buchenwald was never just a labor camp. It had another purpose. One rarely spoken aloud. One never written in official records. Buchenwald was a place where human beings were reduced to components. Not metaphorically. Literally. The SS viewed prisoners as categories, not people. Strong labor units. Weak labor units. Non-productive bodies. Once a prisoner crossed from one category into another, his fate was largely sealed. But some prisoners did not simply disappear. Some were selected. Their bodies did not go directly to the crematorium. They went elsewhere. Prisoners noticed patterns long before they understood them. Men with unusual tattoos were watched, marked, observed during roll call, during work, during inspections. At first, it seemed random. Then it became unmistakable. Those men were removed quietly, without beatings, without shouting. They were told to report somewhere, and they never returned. Inside Buchenwald, Rumors moved faster than food. Whispers passed from bunk to bunk late at night, when exhaustion finally silenced the guards. Something was happening to the bodies. Something beyond execution. Something colder. The camp was organized like a machine. Input, processing, output. Those who could work were kept alive just long enough to be useful. Those who could not were eliminated. And a select few, chosen not for strength, but for physical features, were taken out of the cycle entirely. Their deaths served a different function. This was the logic of Buchenwald. Not chaos, not madness, but order without humanity. A system where suffering was measured, optimized, and repeated daily until resistance became impossible. The goal was not simply to kill. It was to erase. To strip away identity so completely that even the body itself no longer belonged to the person who lived inside it. By the time prisoners understood this, it was already too late. Buchenwald had perfected its method, not through brutality alone, but through patience. And this was only the foundation. Because once life had been reduced to labor, the SS would turn their attention to what remained after life was gone. There is a moment in every system of cruelty when suffering is no longer enough. When pain becomes routine. When death becomes expected. And when those in control begin to ask a darker question. What else can be taken? In Buchenwald, that moment arrived quietly. Not with shouting. Not with mass executions. But with observation. The SS did not see bodies the way prisoners did. To the guards and doctors, a body was not a person, it was a specimen. A collection of parts. A thing to be measured, compared, documented. Under the command of Karl Otto Koch, Buchenwald developed a reputation within the SS system. Not for efficiency, but for experimentation. Medical blocks expanded. Prisoners were injected with diseases, typhus, tuberculosis, then observed as symptoms progressed. Charts were filled out. Timelines recorded. Deaths logged with detached precision. There was no urgency to save lives. Only interests in outcomes. But soon, even this was not enough. Because the bodies did not stop being useful when life ended. Somewhere between the laboratories and the crematorium, the SS crossed a boundary few had imagined possible. The dead were no longer waste. They were resources. Prisoners began to notice subtle changes. Certain corpses were handled differently. Certain bodies were removed quietly, without witnesses. Some were not sent immediately to be burned. At first, no one spoke of it openly. Fear kept mouths shut. But fear does not stop understanding. Patterns emerged. Men with distinctive physical features, unusual bone structure, and even those with visible scars, were watched more closely. They were not beaten. They were not punished. They were selected. Selection in Buchenwald did not always mean immediate death. Sometimes, it meant something worse. And then there was Ilse Koch, the commandant's wife. She did not wear an SS uniform. She did not need to. Her authority came from proximity to power, and from the fear that followed her presence. Prisoners noticed how guards reacted when she appeared. Straighter posture. Sharper attention. Silence. Ilse Koch was often seen walking through the camp, sometimes riding on horseback, observing prisoners as one might observe livestock. Witnesses later described her gaze as curious rather than angry. And that was what terrified them most. Prisoners whispered her name long before the outside world learned it. They called her the Witch of Buchenwald. Not because she shouted, but because after she passed, people disappeared. At first, prisoners assumed execution. Then they noticed something else. Objects began to appear. Quietly. A lampshade in an SS office that did not look like cloth. A book bound in material that did not resemble leather. Decorative items that felt unnatural to the touch. Prisoners assigned to clean SS quarters noticed textures that did not belong in any normal household object. And slowly, a realization spread through the camp. Not spoken, but understood. Human skin, taken from murdered prisoners, was being preserved. treated, processed, turned into decorative items. This was not rumor, though. After liberation, American investigators would confirm it. They found preserved pieces of tattooed human skin among the camp's evidence. Laboratory tests verified what survivors had feared all along. The materials were human. This was not symbolic cruelty. It was literal. And the most disturbing part was not the existence of these objects. It was the intent behind them. These were not products of desperation. They were not created in chaos. They were deliberate, personal. Each item represented a sequence of choices. Someone noticed a prisoner. Someone ordered their removal. Someone approved the process. And someone decided to keep what remained. This was not industrial murder. It was ownership. The SS were no longer content with controlling life and death. They sought control over what came after. In Buchenwald, the human body lost its final boundary. Even in death, it did not belong to itself. This was the cult of death that formed within the camp. Not worship of destruction, but fascination with domination. A belief that power extended beyond the grave. And all of it occurred within a system that called itself orderly, scientific, civilized. Beyond the barbed wire, trains continued to pass. Weimar continued to exist. And inside the camp, human beings were no longer just killed. They were collected. By late 1944, the war had turned. The sounds of Allied bombing could be heard in the distance. Trains arrived less frequently. Supplies grew scarce. And for the first time, something unfamiliar began to spread through Buchenwald. Uncertainty. The system that had once operated with cold precision began to strain under its own weight. Buchenwald became a place of overflow. As Nazi forces retreated across Europe, prisoners from evacuated camps were transported west. Thousands arrived already starving, already sick, already close to death. Barracks built for hundreds now held thousands. Disease spread faster than the guards could control it. Typhus returned. Dysentery followed. Bodies accumulated faster than the crematorium could burn them. Death was no longer quiet. It was everywhere. The SS responded not with mercy, but with urgency. Executions increased. Records were destroyed. Evidence disappeared into fires. But not everything could be erased. Not the buildings. Not the bodies. Not the witnesses. Inside the camp, something else was happening. Something the SS did not expect. Prisoners had been watching, listening, remembering. For years, survival had required silence. Now, it required coordination. An underground resistance had formed within Buchenwald, led by political prisoners who had survived since the camp's earliest days. They had smuggled weapons, passed messages, identified sympathetic guards. They knew the camp could not be evacuated in time. And they knew what evacuation often meant. Death marches. By April 1945, American forces were approaching rapidly. SS guards began to flee. Some abandoned their posts. Others changed into civilian clothes. Authority dissolved almost overnight. On April 11, 1945, the prisoners acted. As the last SS units withdrew, the resistance moved. Guards were disarmed. Watchtowers seized. White flags raised. When American troops entered Buchenwald later that day, they did not find a battle. They found something far worse. They found survivors who looked barely human. Men weighing less than 90 pounds. Children standing among corpses. Barracks filled with bodies stacked like objects. They found medical rooms frozen in time. Instruments left where they had fallen. Records half burned, half saved. And they found evidence. Objects. Things that did not belong in a sane or civilized world. Items made from human remains. Some soldiers turned away immediately. Others stood silently. Many would later say the same thing. We knew about concentration camps, but we did not know about this. General Dwight D. Eisenhower insisted that journalists and politicians be brought to the camp immediately. He feared something specific, that the world might one day refuse to believe what had happened here. The prisoners were free, but freedom did not erase what had been done. Buchenwald did not end when the gates opened. It followed survivors home. It followed soldiers into their sleep. And it remained, etched into the ground, the buildings, the evidence left behind. The camp had collapsed. The system had failed. But the truth remained. And it would demand to be remembered. When Buchenwald fell silent, the world finally saw what had been hidden in plain sight. The barbed wire still stood. The watchtowers still cast their shadows. The barracks still smelled of sickness and smoke. But the system that once controlled every breath was gone. What remained were the survivors. Men and children who stepped out of the camp not as victors, but as witnesses. Many could not return to the lives they once knew. Some had no homes to return to. No families left to find, and all of them carried something that could not be photographed. Memory. The trials that followed tried to impose order on the chaos. Names were read aloud. Crimes were catalogued. Sentences were handed down. Ilse Koch would become one of the most infamous figures connected to Buchenwald. Tried, convicted, released, retried, and ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment in 1951. She would take her own life in 1967. But no verdict could measure what had been taken. No sentence could restore dignity to those who had been reduced to objects. Justice, when it came late and incomplete. Some of the items recovered from Buchenwald were destroyed. Others were preserved behind glass. Not as curiosities, but as warnings. Because they represented something deeper than cruelty. They represented a moment when the human body itself stopped being sacred. Buchenwald forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. It was not hidden in a distant wilderness. It was not unknown. It was not unimaginable. It existed near a city of culture. Near people who lived ordinary lives. Near those who told themselves it was none of their concern. And that is why Buchenwald matters. Not because it was the worst camp. Not because it was unique, but because it shows how easily cruelty can be organized, how efficiently empathy can be erased, and how dangerous it becomes when power is allowed to operate without conscience. History often remembers dates. But dates are easy. What is harder to remember is the horrors. Buchenwald is quiet now, but it is not finished speaking. And it never should be. If you found value in this story, if it helped you understand a part of history that should never be forgotten, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive, and helps ensure they are never erased. Until next time.